So this is a conversation with Zecharias Zelalem. He's an Ethiopian freelance journalist who recently published an investigation alongside Will Brown of The Telegraph on African migrants, mostly Ethiopians, that are quote-unquote left to die in Saudi Arabia's hellish COVID detention centers. That's the title of the investigation. I've actually had Zakaria on a few months ago to talk about what the Lebanese should know about Ethiopia as part of a broader focus on Lebanon's racist kafala system. But this one was a bit different in the sense that we actually focused on Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. In this episode, you can kind of divide it into three different parts. The first part is on that investigation, so looking into what the Saudi government is actually doing to these African migrants, mostly Ethiopian migrants in Saudi Arabia. We are going to talk about pretty horrid things. But we also spoke about the protests that have been happening in Ethiopia, starting from a few months ago and ongoing to this day, against the government following the murder of a popular singer. So Zakaria obviously talked to us about this and explained to us the details and the context of the Ethiopian context as well as the Saudi context. And we squeezed in a bit of Lebanon in between those two conversations as well. I found Zakaria to be a very astute observer and a kind observer, I should say, as well. He actually goes out of his way to find the human stories that are often overlooked. And I know that this has sort of become a cliche to say, but I am really grateful for the sort of work that he does. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and you find it informative. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes. And if you like what I do, please support this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com. And you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
My name is Zecharias Zelalem. I'm an Ethiopian freelance journalist, primarily with the Telegraph newspaper and with Quartz Media. I focus on the Horn of Africa in general, as well as migration, general African migration to the Middle East. And this is my second appearance on this podcast. It's my favorite of them.
Well, glad to have you again. Unfortunately, I mean, not that the first time the topic was particularly cheerful, but so we'll mainly talk, at least as the first part of this conversation, about this investigation that you did with Will Brown of The Telegraph. And the title of the investigation, I have it in front of me, is called African Migrants, quote unquote, Left to Die in Saudi Arabia's hellish COVID detention centers. Obviously, I will link all of this as usual in the blog post, and it's on your Twitter account as well. But would you mind just kind of like setting the scene? What is this investigation about, and what did it reveal?
Sure. It's funny because the last time I appeared on the Fire These Times, it was also about an investigation into something dreadful in the Middle East. So
yes,
I guess the script replays itself. So yeah, unfortunately. So basically, it's the story starts with Saudi Arabia's attempt at containing the COVID-19 outbreak, and the widespread belief, unfortunately, amongst a considerable number of Saudis is that undocumented migrants are vectors, are primarily suspected of facilitating the spread of the disease. So with this belief, Saudi security forces, starting from approximately March, cracked down heavily on undocumented migrants in the kingdom, and a large number of these migrants happen to be Ethiopians. So something like tens of thousands were rounded up within days, and they started the process of deporting them back to Ethiopia sometime in April. It was a mass deportation campaign. within 10 days, they had deported something like 3,000 people. It was global news at the time. And when Ethiopia itself was struggling with its own outbreak, the Ethiopian government requested Saudi Arabia to put a moratorium on the deportations until it was able to upgrade its own quarantine facilities. So Saudi Arabia complied, and what it did then was basically send all the slated deportees to a series of detention centers for the migrants. So this would be approximately mid-April. But what happened over the course of the following 4 or 5 months is that Ethiopia never got back in touch with Riyadh on the subject of the deportees turned detainees. And with that, the detainees just were simply forgotten, left to rot at the detention centers. Those conditions, as we were able to determine, were squalid, absolutely horrifying. As I'm sure you've read in the report, small cramped rooms, you'd have as many as 100 men living in horrific conditions, no food, potential of dying from heat stroke, a variety of diseases, disfiguring skin conditions, and they were left in these conditions for months. It drove many to insanity, and tragically there were suicides, and they were left like that for about 5 or 6 months. And I'm sadly pretty confident that had it not been for our reporting, this issue would not have been given any importance whatsoever, whether it was by Saudi Arabia's government or by the Ethiopian government. And coming from a country like Saudi Arabia, which had detained hundreds of members of its elite during Mohammed bin Salman's anti-corruption purge, these arrestees were kept at 5-star hotels at world-class venues. And then you have the poorest of the poor in conditions that are absolutely detrimental to one's physical and mental being. They were the conditions that they were kept in, the detention centers, were akin to concentration camps. My colleague Will Brown described them as the slave camps that the world got a glimpse of a couple of years ago in Libya.
Yeah, in Libya. Yeah.
So it's been like that since April. A lot of these prisoners have been there for 5-6 months, and we managed to come by local contacts in Saudi Arabia, very helpful contacts, who were able to put me in touch with the detainees at 2 of these detention centers: the Al Shumaisi detention center, not far from the holy city of Mecca, and the Jizan center, which is in the port city of Jizan, near the border with Yemen and near the Red Sea. So phones were smuggled into these 2 centers, and with that, over the course of around a month and a half or so, I was able to communicate regularly with detainees in both centers. I was able to learn how long they were there, what had brought them there. For the large part, the migrants had gone via the very extremely dangerous refugee migrant corridor via Djibouti and Yemen. And most of them had escaped a Houthi onslaught in the area. Houthis had targeted migrants for similar reasons as the Saudis, fearing that they were facilitating the spread of the coronavirus. So I'm told that many were killed, many were injured, many were detained by the Houthis. The survivors escaped and made it to Saudi Arabia, where unfortunately many of them ended up being detained and currently find themselves in the detention centers, which I later investigated as part of the Telegraph. So around a month and a half of communicating with them, of learning of their conditions, with the smuggled phones, you would have people on the outside sending them mobile data. So this gave the detainees access to the internet, access to applications like Telegram. So I was able to communicate via video call. So I was able to have a live look at what these centers looked like. And I can, from the 5 or 6 years or so of journalism, I don't think anything will strike me as when I was communicating with detainees from the comfort of my home. These are detainees who were famished, who had various skin diseases, who had marks from whippings, beatings that they were subjected to by Saudi prison guards. I saw this live and with my own eyes, and it marked me. So the first part of our three-part series into this investigation was basically relaying to the rest of the world what it was that they were subjected to and the messages that they had for both the Saudi government and the Ethiopian government.
Yeah, it really struck me in the piece. There is a quote by basically one of the persons talking to you, told you like the gods mock us. They say your government doesn't care. What are we supposed to do with you? It really speaks a lot to obviously the elephant in the room here is how the Saudi regime treats African migrants and African refugees in Saudi Arabia, which I guess wouldn't necessarily surprise anyone, unfortunately, but I think it should still shock people if we're able to still be shocked by these things. But what also another thing that you said, and it's not that relevant to the wider story necessarily, but it does strike me as well that even the Houthis, who are supposed to be the enemies of the Saudis, could actually agree with them on this thing. Namely the fact that they're both very racist, which is quite extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, it is very difficult. You mentioned there's the first of 3 parts. First, can I ask you, like, have the governments, the respective governments, in this case Saudi Arabia and the Ethiopian governments, have they actually said anything since you published?
Yes, we included their quotes as part of a second subsequent piece. Okay. So we received an emailed response from the Saudi embassy in London, and they virtually concede that our findings were correct. They do not contest them. The Saudi embassy told us that the images were harrowing and, quote, against our culture and unacceptable in our country, and that the conditions in the mentioned prisons would be investigated, and if anything was deemed lacking, it would be addressed. That's what we were told. But at the same time, the Saudis also reiterated that they were more than willing to send these migrants back home. They were more than willing to cover the costs of the deportation, to send them back to Addis Ababa on a one-way flight, but that it was the Ethiopian government that had requested that they not do this. And it was the Ethiopian government that was, I guess, in the way they were trying to frame it, behind the continuous stay of these migrants in these Saudi detention centers. As for on the Ethiopian side, I was able to speak with a representative from Ethiopia's foreign ministry, and she told me that prior to the Telegraph report, the Ethiopian government was unaware of the suffering of its citizens in these detention centers, and that Ethiopia's embassy, or the embassy in Riyadh, and the consulate in Jeddah had not notified Ethiopian authorities of the ongoings in Jazan and Al-Shumaisi, something that I found extraordinary and to a degree unbelievable. I was very skeptical, as I often am when communicating with representatives of the Ethiopian government, but this was their official response. I found it very interesting that the Ethiopian government representatives that I communicated with refrained from outright criticizing Saudi authorities for their treatment of Ethiopian citizens. And of course, this could be, obviously, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, a country that's assisting to a considerable degree with Ethiopia's foreign currency shortage. I believe it was something like 4 or 5 months ago that the Saudis offered 150 million US dollars for business loans for small businesses in Ethiopia. And at the beginning of the current prime minister's tenure, it was Saudi's ally, uh, comrade, partner in arms, the United Arab Emirates, that had chipped in with $3 billion for Ethiopia's forex shortages. So with these in mind, obviously these are not, Riyadh isn't an ally that Ethiopia would want to clash with, but at the same time, to almost downplay our findings, to say this is something we haven't heard of, just to say that this is it was almost put very lightly. There was I could say she had to almost restrain herself from directly addressing the abuses. I had to raise the question 2 or 3 times in order to solicit a sort of response. And in the end, Tsiyon Teklu, the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry's state minister, said, we have no direct reaction to what we've seen. However, we will raise it with our Saudi counterparts, which, you know, is extremely mellowed down. So yeah, that's what we've been told thus far.
And so as of now, there are no actual plans of repatriating them?
No. So what happened is the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry, because the articles triggered backlash, international backlash, local media and a torrent of international media outlets followed up with subsequent reports. And when it became unavoidable, the Foreign Ministry held a presser on the issue 2 or 3 days ago. And they stated that they had planned on repatriating something like 2,000 Ethiopian migrants in Saudi Arabia, which, you know, in the eyes of those who aren't keen observers of Ethiopia's migration issue, it might be deemed solving the problem. But Ethiopians in Saudi Arabia number in the hundreds of thousands. Many of them have been there legally for decades. The 2,000, I mean, if they're not migrants from one of the 2 detention centers cited in our report, well, then the problem is not dealt with. The only way you can really resolve the issue now is if you announce to the world that there are measures being taken to either negotiate with Saudi Arabia and to ensure that the continuous abuses of detainees in these centers are halted. Otherwise, you hasten preparations for their return home. And I spoke with Ethiopia's Consul General to Jeddah, Mr. Abdu Yassin, and he confirmed to me that neither was in the works for the time being. So I found that rather unpleasant, and it left me with something of a sour taste in my mouth.
And can you give us just maybe some numbers of what you know anyway, or how many people are we talking about in those 2 centers? And you mentioned that a significant percentage of them are Ethiopians. Is it a majority? And where are the others from?
I mean, I could say it's almost the entirety. There are several, from what the migrants have told me, there are several Eritreans. Right. Eritrea is a neighboring country, which shares, which until 1991 was part of Ethiopia. And there are several Somali migrants as well, but for the large part, these are Ethiopians. It's Ethiopians that form the bulk of the migrant worker community in Saudi Arabia. It's almost similar to the situation in Lebanon. So they're almost entire. This is more or less an Ethiopian issue. We just used the term African because we did not want to perpetuate erasure considering the fact that there are migrants of other nationalities in those prisons, but they are almost entirely Ethiopians. I communicated with almost all of them in the Amharic language. With regards to the question on numbers, I wasn't able to determine exactly how many were there. I mean, I was able to geolocate the prison sites with the prisoners sending me their locations on the encrypted Telegram app. So from what I was able to see, for instance, the Al Shumaisi detention center, On Google Maps, there's something like 8 or 9 of these large prison cells. The detainees I spoke to were in one, and they told me that they were something like 80 or 90 in the one cell. So if there were 8 or 9, that would easily make 600, 700. If they're packed, if that detention center was packed, that could be anywhere from 700 to 800 prisoners at Al Shumaisi alone. And there is almost a similar number of blocks and rooms at the Jazan Center. So, if they were packed, we're talking about thousands of detainees. Of course, this isn't something that I was able to independently confirm. The migrants say it's their belief that they're in the thousands, but we went with hundreds, maybe thousands, because we were not able to confirm that each and every cell block contained 100 prisoners. Maybe they were all packed, maybe some were packed. It's impossible, obviously, to go on the ground and verify this. One of the sites, the Jazan site, is, I believe, something of a Saudi military base. At the same time, you see there are helicopter launching pads, and it's very secure. It's a walled compound. So I believe it's some sort of military site at the same time. So it would be impossible to corroborate via Saudi authorities, the nature of these sites, the holding capacity of these sites. But it is our estimate, and it's also the estimate of Human Rights Watch, which also did its own report on these centers, that these prisoners could easily number in the thousands.
Yeah. On the more personal side, I guess, would you mind, with as many details as you feel comfortable sharing, of course, just give us some kind of stories for the people who haven't read the article yet. As I mentioned, I will link those anyway, but just so that the episode itself remains internally coherent in a sense. Can you tell us just some of the stories, and after telling us these stories, I guess the more personal aspect as well is like, how does that affect you? This at the very, very least, and this is putting it very mildly, this cannot be very easy. And we obviously have the image, which I think is not a very good one, of like the journalist being sort of detached and just reporting the facts and so on. But these are very human stories at the end of the day, and they're not easy to report on.
Yeah, they're not easy to report on at all. So with regards to the victims, the unfortunate prisoners at these detention centers, I've spoken to something like 6 or 7 of them from the 2 sites, and their stories are very identical. They all hail from poor families in parts of rural Ethiopia. Many of them come from the Tigray region in the north of the country, and that area is closer to Djibouti and closer to the Red Sea and to Yemen. So a lot of them pay thousands of Ethiopian birr, which would, I guess, amount to hundreds of dollars, to pay for traffickers to smuggle them across the Red Sea and into camps in Yemen. And from there, they travel on foot across the desolate desert, sometimes in areas that are afflicted by the ongoing conflict. So you have a war zone, and you also have the fact that this area is breeding ground for organ traffickers, migrant traffickers, people just out to make a quick buck, out to ransom you. It's an extremely dangerous and extremely deadly migrant route. Thousands of Ethiopians go through it every year. And even if you survive Yemen, you can be shot at the border with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian border guards are infamous for their indiscriminate gunning down of migrants. It's something that's been well documented. So these detainees are, in all aspects, they're survivors and heroes just for making it that far. So many of them shared with me stories of their comrades and friends being shot in the desert, somewhere in the Yemeni desert, whether it's closer to Djibouti or near the Saudi border, and by either the Houthis or by Saudi security personnel. So the impact, like the stories that they share, like I guess Homer said it, the journey is the thing. Their journeys were just absolutely horrendous, even prior to being detained by the Saudi border guards. Upon arrival in Saudi Arabia, I mean, these men, all they did was head out in search of work. They come from, a lot of them were farmers. They grew up in farming communities. Some of them were shepherds. Others worked in extremely low-paying jobs. Ethiopia has one of the lowest GDPs in the world, and the employment rates are also very low for a country of 110 million. So as the government is not addressing that critical issue, numbers of Ethiopian youths who flee the country for the Middle East will always grow. And this has been a problem ongoing for a decade or so. So these young men are just a product of Ethiopia's societal failures. And unfortunately, the Saudi government's primary tool with dealing with them is to very violently arrest them. And oftentimes they are deported after a week. So these detainees, they tell me that they expected their stay in prison to be very brief. For the most part, they were very heartbroken to have gone all that way, to have spent thousands of Ethiopian birr, to risk being shot at both in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia, only to be detained and then deported a week later. I mean, and to have gone through all that, to have witnessed the deaths of friends just to make it back home empty-handed, it's crushing. Obviously, that's how many of them described it. But 5 months in these detention centers, right now, most of them are reaching the point of mental breakdown. Many have. There were suicides in there. I unfortunately was given very disturbing video footage of what appeared to be the final moments of a young man who had hanged himself, and I needed to watch it to corroborate certain accounts. And I was able to confirm, and I can confirm that there have been deaths from youths who have just grown disillusioned by the journey, by the loss, and by the hopelessness that's instilled within you after 5 months in a virtual concentration camp. So at this point, however, most of the migrants are just eager to get back home. That's like, from this point on, making a living in Saudi Arabia, finding work in the country is the last thing on their minds. Most of these youths started their journeys prior to the breakout of a global pandemic. At this point in time, many are not going via those migrant corridors because they're very well aware that the job availabilities have diminished considerably since the pandemic. But these were the last of the bunch. They were the unfortunate final batch of migrants to have made the trips prior to everything locking down. So they're the ones stuck in perpetual limbo because due to the pandemic, Ethiopia did not want to receive them, and Saudi Arabia did not know what to do with them, and wasn't willing to keep them in humane conditions that they would deserve. So the young men would share with me stories of what it's like to be confined in these centers for 5 months. The young men haven't been outdoors since March, April. If heat stroke won't kill you, it's the sewage from the overflowing toilets. The smell will kill you. The sanitation conditions will kill you. The lack of food. These things, they'll obviously have a very detrimental effect on your mental and physical health. So most of them tell me that they haven't told their families. They've just told their families that they're looking for work. You know, they don't want their mothers and fathers to be worrying for 5 months about whether they'll wake up to receive the news of their child dying. So most of them say they have not told their families about their current predicament. and it's been like that for 5 months. And they say that's a degree. There's a degree of optimism now because they have the smuggled phones, and they're very well aware that this has suddenly become a global talking issue, and they're much happier now that that their issue has gotten, at least to some degree, the attention it deserves. But of course, that optimism will obviously wane if another month, another 2 months goes by, and neither government is willing to resolve the issue. As for me personally, the sort of impact it has had on me, I mean, I'm Ethiopian too. I belong to the same culture, the same, the same upbringing as many of these migrants. So I guess there's sort of like I don't know, there's the sentiments of guilt that I sometimes feel because I ended up, I mean, I'm not where I am currently. There is no overflowing sewage. I can eat 3 times a day. There is nothing that separated me from many of them. But fate brought us together. And when we were able to meet via video conference, I did so from the comfort of my bed, and they did so in a disease-racked hellhole. Like, we speak the same languages, we use the same slang. The cultural, there are no cultural differences. There are so many things that bind us together, and yet our situations contrast terribly. Like, there was this sentiments of guilt, the sentiment of just, you grow up and you just wake up and you say, what an accursed world. Like, how could they, like, why them, why me? It makes you question the state of things. And at the end, the good thing is it did spurred me on to do what I could with my colleague Will Brown to make sure that their story was delivered to global audiences in the best way we could.
What you're describing, my friend, is survivor's guilt, something I am
survivor's guilt
on at this point.
Oh.
Well, as someone who's been on the receiving end of some of the Saudi, pro-MBS, I should say, Saudi trolls,
yeah.
I do know that it's pretty much the only thing that they really are worried about whenever there is this kind of international pressure. The Saudi government is actually, as we know, obviously from the Jamal Khashoggi debacle, they tend to be put on the spot quite often because they don't actually plan for it. They don't actually prepare for it. They don't expect that these things actually come out. And with something like the story that you ended up uncovering with Will Brown, I could simply imagine that they didn't really think much about it. It was just this afterthought, and they knew that, or they were hoping anyway, that nothing much would come out of it. But this is on the Saudi side, so I guess we can hope, if that's the correct word, that this sort of international pressure that we're seeing right now, would continue, because unfortunately the attention span of the world tends to be very short nowadays. But hopefully we can continue to put more on this, and this episode obviously is a small contribution to that. But the other thing, so this would be on the Saudi side, but on the Ethiopian side is something that I feel many people, if not most people listening to this, if listeners have listened to the last episode we did, which I think I titled "What the Lebanese Should Know About Ethiopia" or something, they might get some background info there. But let's consider this the second part of the episode in some ways, not that there's any strict delineation, of getting a bit more into the Ethiopian government. What is its deal? Why is it that difficult sometimes? Not sometimes, quite frequently, when it comes to migrants abroad, to get them to actually do anything. And of course, I'm referring here to the Lebanese case as well, so we can get into this a bit as well. And yes, let's just get a bit more into this, and we'll sort of maybe third section of this episode will be on the actual protests that have been happening in Ethiopia recently as well, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, with regards to the issues of Ethiopian migrants in the Middle East, I mean, Ethiopia still is one of the poorest countries in the world. Ethiopia has not done anything to bridge the gap between its wealthy elite and the poorest, the majority, the masses, and the bottom ranges of society. And as such, unfortunately, there will always be masses of Ethiopian youths who feel they have no alternative but to flock towards Yemen, Libya, for women as domestic workers in Lebanon or Saudi Arabia. And as such, Ethiopia, you would think decades on, Ethiopia should have diplomatic missions instructed with dealing with the endless issues, the endless woes faced by these migrants in their host countries. But something like 20, 30 years on since Ethiopians started flocking towards the Middle East, you still see Ethiopian consular missions, Ethiopian diplomatic institutions abroad, very lacking in their approach to the suffering of their citizens in the Middle East in particular. I mean, we've dwelt a lot on the Ethiopian government's failures in Lebanon with regards to the kafala system and their failure to safeguard the dignity of Ethiopian migrants in Lebanon, for instance. In Saudi Arabia, you would have expected things to be a degree better because we're talking about Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. These are two countries who generally share very, very warm ties and diplomatic relations, unlike Ethiopia and Lebanon. Especially the current prime minister, I think Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates might be the countries where he's made the most state visits since 2018. He's a frequent visitor. He has a frequent presence in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and this is why we assume that hashing out a deal, which would, even if it wouldn't abolish the kafala system right away, it would at the very least ensure a degree of accountability, a degree of at the very least ensure that Ethiopians would have avenues to go to protect their dignity, to protect their rights in the kingdom. The warm ties should have by now assured this. The fact that there have been Ethiopian communities in Saudi Arabia, blossoming Ethiopian communities since the late 80s, meant that 2-3 decades along the line, the Ethiopian government should have a team of experts in dealing with trauma and dealing with victims of rape, abuse, enslavement. There are many competent professionals that should be deployed there. However, as has been the case and is still currently the case, we have diplomats who, for the most part, strive to sugarcoat the suffering of their citizens and who pursue. I guess we have diplomats who are mandated above all in ensuring that Saudi Arabia remains on, I guess, good terms with Ethiopia. So Ethiopia will have a regular source of foreign exchange to deal with Ethiopia's own economic crisis, a burgeoning economic crisis. And that's why when, for the third article that I released on this, someone had leaked to me a document. I had a leaked document that revealed that Ethiopian authorities were aware of the suffering in the two different detention facilities since at the very least June. So that would be 2.5 months ago or so. Yeah. And yet I was told that they were completely unaware. A government official told me that they had only just learned about it. So there was an attempt to shove this under the rug. There was an attempt to silence Ethiopians. There was an attempt to ensure that the cries of Ethiopian citizens in these detention centers did not make it beyond those detention centers. And with diplomats with this sort of mentality, we cannot expect the Ethiopian government to make any leeway towards ensuring that its citizens aren't mistreated in Saudi Arabia. And the difference between, for instance, Saudi Arabia and Lebanon is, at the very least in Lebanon, the government can say there are financial constraints with regards to repatriating its citizens, with regards to hiring a lawyer and things like that. In Saudi Arabia, Riyadh is literally willing to cover the costs of return for all of these migrants. It does not have the economic woes. It cannot be compared economically with Lebanon, which is still in crisis. So it really highlights the shortcomings and the lack of intent on the part of Ethiopian missions abroad. So you have disasters in the Ethiopian communities in both Lebanon and Saudi Arabia right now. And as I speak, the Ethiopian ambassadors and consuls of these two countries, as well as those of other countries, are meeting at a resort town in Ethiopia, Bishoftu, where they're gathering to discuss their yearly achievements, whatever they may be, and their plans for the coming Ethiopian year. I mean, we're in crisis mode, and they're at a resort town. I think this in itself is very reflective of just how little importance is given to the endless issues and the endless challenges being faced by Ethiopian migrants in the Middle East, and in particular right now, Lebanon and Saudi Arabia.
And more on the Lebanon side of it, I would redirect listeners to the episode that we did on that specifically. And I can also redirect listeners to Anya Lenya's website, which I also just add on a blog post. But for those listening right now, it's egnalegna.org, Anya Lenya. And they do quite a lot of work on that. They're a group of Ethiopians in Lebanon and Ethiopia, and I think parts of the diaspora as well, doing quite a lot of good work on that. Well, I mean, it's no longer elephant in the room since we already brought it up now, but the Ethiopian government has come under quite a lot of increased attention in recent months. I think that's very fair to say. Can you, with as many words as you feel comfortable, of course, give us some kind of overview? And I know this is a big topic, so the episode would would serve more of a introduction to it, and we can organize something more in depth at a later date, to the protests that have happened in recent months, their significance. Let's just get into it, if that's okay. But
sure. So as you said, there have been recent breakouts of anti-government protests in parts of Ethiopia, and I guess we'd have to go back to the current government's coming to power in 2018. The current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, he came to power in 2018 on the back of popular uprisings. Prior to his ascension to power, the same administration had been ruling the country with an iron fist for 27 years. So eventually, when Ethiopians said enough is enough, uprisings starting in 2015 and really intensifying in 2016, forced the resignation of the previous prime minister and brought the current leadership to the throne. So obviously Ethiopians right now have a far thinner tolerance for authoritarianism because we grew up in it. We spent decades in a country that had no free press, in a country where journalists and outspoken activists would be rounded up for being critical voices in the country. So when the current leadership started to deviate away from the path of reform that it had been championed for, well, immediately citizens in the country started to express their frustration in various ways via the media, via social media, and in what were initially smaller protests. The other thing is, with this new administration, a lot of people had demanded that that much needed dialogue amongst the different ethnic groups, that the different political parties in the country, something that had been censored, something that had been avoided for decades. A lot of Ethiopians demanded that these be carried out under the current leadership, and the government has refrained from doing so, and this just led to gradually brewing. And in particular among the Oromo, one of the largest, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, the resent was even greater because this is one of the marginalized, the traditionally marginalized groups in the country. And then things really took a turn for the worse on June 29th when a popular musician, Hachalu Hundessa, who was also a rights activist for the Oromo, was assassinated in Addis Ababa. When that happened, the popular outrage boiled over, protests intensified, and it led to riots and killings, tragic, horrific killings in some parts of the country as well. But what is unavoidable since that murder, since June 29th, is that a considerable amount of Ethiopians have had it with the current government and with its refusal to address long festering wounds and long neglected issues that the previous administration had also left unaddressed. And this has led to protests primarily amongst the traditionally oppressed ethnic groups. The Oromo is the largest of the oppressed ethnic groups, and thus a lot of the protests are focused in the Oromia region, and there are protests elsewhere in the country. So we've sort of drifted away from championing a leader who had been applauded globally for his attempts at fostering reconciliation and at opening up the media space. And since then, he's been criticized for sort of reneging on these promises and major setbacks because journalists are once again being arrested, activists are once again being arrested. Most of the major opposition parties, their leaders have been arrested and are being charged with things like treason, terrorism, the things that you would associate with a dictatorship. And it's not what most had hoped for when this government was appointed in 2018. And the protests are ongoing. The demands that have been raised by the protesters are yet to be properly addressed, and push has come to shove, and the government is not going to be able to maintain. I'm of the opinion that the government will not be able to maintain the current pace unless it compromises to some degree. We are yet to see if the government is open to the dialogue that the country so badly needs.
So we are dealing with a full-scale crackdown at this point.
Yes, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say so. I believe it was starting from June 30th, something like 12,000 people were arrested. Mm-hmm. And the government's narrative is that these people were involved in some of the killings, the brutal killings that took place in early July. However, I've been able to determine that the majority of the protesters, or the majority of the detainees arrested, were simply protesting and were simply taking part in anti-government protests that took place especially during the first week of July. In August, more protests had broken out, and they were met with a very heavy-handed government response. Scores of protesters were killed. More were arrested. I mean, it is essentially, as you put it, this is a government crackdown, reminiscent to what Ethiopians had seen in 2016, which was a very dark chapter in our modern history.
Can you speak a bit more about that as well?
Sure. So, as I said, the current leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power on the back of popular uprisings that broke out in 2015 and 16. And before those protests forced the resignation of the then Prime Minister Hachalu Hundessa, something like 1,000 protesters were gunned down by security forces. There were tens of thousands of arrests. There were makeshift camps set up across the country in the protester hotbeds to round up youths. there were almost, especially in 2016, there were daily killings of protesters. There would be killings in parts of the Oromia region as well as the Amhara region. These were the two major, they are the two largest ethnic groups, and they were the two major zones for anti-government protest activity. So 2015 and 2016 were, above all, they will be remembered for the bloodshed of unarmed protesters, selfless demonstrators who said enough was enough and took a stand against the authoritarianism in the country. And it was after that these demonstrations, that this protest movement was able to force the change in government, that a lot of exiled leaders, exiled politicians, and journalists were able to return to the country, including myself. So a lot of us, when we returned, we were very, very optimistic with unprecedented change that the country hadn't seen in something like 3 decades. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the enthusiasm has waned considerably in the 2 years since.
And can we say that there are certain things that the government, let's say if we put on a more idealistic hat, what are certain things that the government could be doing right now that would actually be seen as legitimate compromises or actual reforms? What are certain things that you might say are legitimate grievances and demands that are coming out of the streets?
Well, one of the major demands right now is the fact that the major demand right now is for Ethiopian forces to withdraw from parts of Oromia. There is an ongoing civil war in the west of the country with an armed separatist group and the military. However, it is of the general public's understanding that the armed separatist group is more than willing to sit down for dialogue. The government has had a really a simple approach to the matter. There is no compromise. There is no negotiation. The military solution is all that will be used to solve this civil war. And in the civil war, we've had reports of killings, extrajudicial killings of civilians, arrests of people suspected of supporting the rebels, and Amnesty International has documented a lot of these killings. This civil war is highly unnecessary. It's something that could easily be solved through dialogue, and it is a major grievance for people who, the Ethiopian people who are sick and tired of war. I mean, we grew up in war. The prime minister who won the Nobel Peace Prize won it because he essentially put an end to the hostile state of war that the country was in with neighboring Eritrea. So people are unhappy that we ended one state of war only to enter another state of war with a domestic entity that's willing to settle things around the negotiation tables. So that's one of the major grievances that people, in particular the Oromo, have. Aside that, there's the obvious issue with political prisoners, who right now number in the tens of thousands. Once again, a lot of them were arrested en masse simply for taking part in protests, and the judicial system is siding with the government in the sense that the Constitution would require charges to be laid within 48 hours, evidence to be presented. There have been countless cases in recent months of detainees, renowned government critics, spending weeks, sometimes months, without charges, without evidence being presented against them. Protesters are now demanding that the judicial system be reformed, that it regain its independence, and that a degree of accountability for government abuses, especially, and army killings, be fostered by whoever it is that takes up the mantle of reforming the justice system. there's still far too much partisan sentiment in what are supposed to be independent Ethiopian institutions,
Right.
and this has caused a problem. And this is a country that was supposed to be heading into its first free democratic elections, and with opposition parties in jail, I don't see how that's going to happen, and neither do many of the protesters. These are only some of the things the government's going to have to recognize its own faults on and reach a compromise on.
I can only hope that this happens. What are certain kind of like on a closing note on my side anyway? Then I'll just open up the floor to you if you want to conclude on a different note or something. But where can people? Well, first of all, where can people find your own work, and what are some good resources if you have them on what's going on right now in Ethiopia in terms of the protests that people can follow? And if you can't think of anything on the spot, we'll just link them later on. It's not a big deal.
Sure. So personally, I freelance just about everywhere. I'm primarily freelancing for the Telegraph, but I also write with South African outlet Mail and Guardian and Quartz News, where I do try to address these issues from time to time. Also CNN sometimes. As for there are plenty of local platforms that would offer a much more nuanced take, especially for those who are only just starting to become to follow up on what it is that's going on in Ethiopia. I do recommend Addis Standard, which I used to write for, as well as Ethiopia Insight. These are two local platforms who have not lost their editorial independence, and their reporting has been pretty stellar, at least at least up to this moment. And they're one of the very few English language portals in the country. So I would strongly recommend those two. Aside that, from foreign outlets, The Guardian and Al Jazeera are a regular source of information, although they're not a consistent source of information, but generally speaking, their reporting on Ethiopian issues is pretty accurate. So I would always recommend, like I would for any issue, balancing a bit of the local, a bit of the international, and then coming to one's own conclusion. Obviously, in this day and age, there is no single portal that I would recommend for anyone to maintain as their sole source of news. Diversifying is always important, verifying, and yeah, there's more than enough journalists, including myself, that would be more than open to entertaining queries, whatever the nature.
Amazing. Well, my friend, this is not a easy topic. Well, these 3 topics that we've talked about, these are not very easy. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and to come on this podcast again. And yeah, what can I say? Good luck on moving forward. I know I'll be following your work as well, and I urge the listeners to do the same.
Thank you very much, Joey. And thanks for remaining resilient and astute despite the obvious challenges that you and your family have faced in the wake of the Beirut explosion. I've always admired your intestinal fortitude and your mental strength to keep addressing your following, to keep your loyal faithful up to date. Sorry, with the let me say that again. This is what happens when you withdraw from coffee. What I wanted to say is, as one of the very many listeners, faithful, loyal listeners, I'm absolutely grateful for your remaining resilient despite your personal woes and the horrendous loss and your
You're too kind.
How do I say this?
It's okay. I got
all
the
I'm gonna say is this. You got the message, right? I don't know how you're gonna edit that, but just hang in there.
Fine.
I appreciate it. Stay strong, and I got your back if anything.
Thank you, man. Same to you. Take care.
I appreciate it, Joey. Stay in touch.
Absolutely, you too.